Clayton Morse reined his horse at the ridge and saw them. Two figures bent like question marks over a pile of broken timber. But something was wrong with the picture. The storm had passed 3 days ago, a monster that bruised and battered the whole valley. Frost clung to the sage like old lace, and the sky hung low and gray, still catching its breath. Clayton had ridden out at dawn to check his land. 12,000 acres of Montana grassland, stretching from this very ridge all the way to the river. His fences were down. That was expected. But the main house stood untouched. The barns, the bunkhouse, the corral, all intact. He'd been lucky. He knew others hadn't been. And from the ridge he could see the old Doyle homestead, half a mile down. The cabin sagged on one side. Its roof was torn open like a wound. And there, in the muddy yard, Henry and Martha Doyle were dragging logs twice their size, across the frozen ground. Clayton urged his horse forward, picking his way down the rocky path. The closer he got, the clearer the picture became, and the more wrong it felt. Henry was 70 if he was a day, his back curved from a lifetime of hard labor. Martha wasn't far behind, her gray braids swinging as she bent to lift a timber that should have taken 3 strong men to even budge. They didn't notice him until his shadow fell across their work. "Morning, Mr. Morse," Henry said, but he didn't look up. He just drove a wedge under the log, testing its weight. "That ain't work for folks your age," Clayton said. His voice came out harder than he meant. "All stop now. I'll send my men." Henry straightened up, slow, his hands still gripping the wedge. His eyes were sharp and clear, the kind of eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by anything, or anyone. "We ain't hiring out our dignity, Mr. Morse." The words were quiet, but they hit Clayton like a hammer. Clayton opened his mouth, then closed it. Behind Henry, Martha had stopped working, too. She didn't say a word. She just wiped her hands on her apron and looked at Clayton. And her eyes. They held something that wasn't quite pity, but it felt close enough to sting. "Storm took half the cabin," Henry said, his tone flat. "Even. We'll put it back." "You'll kill yourselves trying," Clayton shot back. "Maybe." Henry turned back to his work. "But we'll die doing something that matters." Clayton sat frozen in the saddle. The old man didn't wait for a response, didn't argue, didn't explain. He just bent back to his labor, as if Clayton Morse, the man who owned the entire valley, wasn't even there at all. After a long, cold moment, Clayton pulled his horse around. He rode back toward the ridge, but he didn't go home. He stopped at the top of the hill and looked back. They were still working. 2 small, stubborn figures against a huge, broken landscape, stubborn as winter itself. A man's word and his work, that's all the wealth he's got. His father used to say that. Clayton hadn't thought about those words in years. Now they rattled around in his chest like stones in a tin can. He turned his horse toward home, but that image followed him all the way back. Inside his mansion, Clayton couldn't taste his coffee. The fire crackled in the massive stone hearth, throwing warm light across polished floors and expensive furniture. Fine rugs, leather chairs, paintings his late wife, Sarah, had chosen. It was warm, it was safe, it was empty. He kept seeing those bent backs, kept hearing Henry's voice. "We ain't hiring out our dignity." Clayton set down his cup and walked to the window. His foreman, Jack Reeves, was crossing the yard toward the barn. Good man, Jack. Loyal. Been with Clayton for 15 years, since before Sarah got sick, since before everything went silent. Clayton pressed his palm against the cold glass. 2 years. 2 years since Sarah died. 2 years of this house getting bigger and quieter every single day. Meals eaten alone, mornings where he couldn't remember why he even bothered to get out of bed. The ranch ran itself. The money piled up in accounts he never checked. And Clayton Morse just moved through it all, a ghost in his own life. He remembered Henry Doyle from 30 years back. Clayton was just starting out then, fresh off a bad winter. Half his herd lost, creditors circling like vultures. Henry had ridden over one morning. Didn't say much. Just spent 3 days helping Clayton mend fence. 3 days, sunup to sundown. Didn't ask for payment. Didn't preach. Didn't offer pity. He just worked. Some things you pay back, Henry had said, coiling a piece of wire. Some things you pay forward. Clayton hadn't thought about that in decades. There was a knock at the door. Jack stepped inside, hat in hand. "Boss, about the Doyle place. Storm hit 'em hard. Want me to send a crew over?" "No." Jack blinked, confused. "Boss, they're gonna need help. That cabin's barely standing." "I know." "So," Clayton turned from the window. "I'll handle it." Jack frowned. "Handle it? How?" "I don't know yet." Clayton grabbed his coat from the rack. "But not by sending men to do it for them. That's not what they need." "What do they need, then?" Clayton paused in the doorway. "Pride's a hard horse to ride, but sometimes it's the only one you got." He looked at Jack, and his foreman's expression was strange, almost unreadable. "They need someone to stop treating them like they're already in the ground," Clayton said. He left before Jack could ask any more questions. In the barn, he loaded a wagon, timber from his mill, good pine already cut and planed, nails, a toolbox, rope. At the last minute, he went back to the kitchen, packed a basket with bread, cheese, and a pot of yesterday's stew. He rode out before dawn the next day, not entirely sure what he was doing. But the silence of that big, empty house felt heavier than any storm. And for the first time in 2 years, Clayton Morse wanted to be somewhere else. Martha saw the dust before the wagon. She was stirring beans over an outdoor fire. The cabin stove was buried under half a collapsed roof. The wind whipped through the broken walls, sharp and cold, carrying the smell of more snow. Her hands were numb, but she kept stirring. If you stopped moving, the cold got in. That was the rule. The wagon came down the valley road, slow and steady. Martha's hand tightened on the ladle. Charity always came with a bill. Sometimes money, sometimes gratitude, sometimes the quiet surrender of your independence. She didn't want to owe anyone, especially not Clayton Morse. Henry looked up from the timber pile, squinting into the morning sun. "That's Morse. I see him. Think he brought trouble or help?" "Both, probably," Martha said. Clayton pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. He didn't smile. He didn't offer pleasantries. He just gestured to the loaded bed. "Brought materials. And food. Figured you could use both." Martha set down the ladle and wiped her hands on her apron. "That's kind of you, Mr. Morse. But we're managing." "Doesn't look like managing to me." "Looks can lie," Henry said mildly. He walked over, inspecting the timber in the wagon. "Good quality," he noted. "Expensive." He turned those sharp eyes on Clayton. "What's the price?" "No price." "There's always a price." Clayton's jaw tightened. "Call it payment. For 30 years ago. You helped me. You didn't ask for anything back." Henry studied him for a long, hard moment. Then he shook his head. "We built this place once. We'll build it again. Don't need your timber." The refusal was absolute, and it made no sense. "You're being foolish," Clayton said, frustration creeping into his voice. "This storm could have killed you. Winter's coming. You can't—" "Can't what?" Martha stepped forward, her voice soft but laced with steel. "Can't rebuild our home. Can't take care of ourselves, Mr. Morse." Her eyes bored into him. "We've survived droughts, blizzards, a war that took our son. We'll survive this too." Clayton stared at her. The certainty in her voice was absolute. It was the kind of certainty that came from living through hell and walking out the other side. "Living scared's just dying slow, Mr. Morse," Martha continued. We choose different. The words hit him like a fist to the chest. Living scared, dying slow. He thought of his big, empty house, his careful 2-year isolation, the 2 years he'd spent hiding from everything that hurt. "At least eat with us," Martha said, her voice softer now. "Beans are almost ready." Clayton hesitated. Then he nodded. They ate in silence, sitting on stumps around the fire. The beans were thin, but they were hot. And Martha's cornbread was better than anything Clayton's cook had made in months. He watched them as they ate. He saw the way Henry's hand shook slightly when he lifted the spoon. He saw the way Martha's breath came hard after the simple act of stirring a pot. They were old, they were tired, but they weren't broken. After the meal, Clayton stood. He looked at the cabin, the collapsed section, the missing roof, the cracked foundation stones. Then he looked at Henry and Martha, who were already moving back toward the timber pile. The wolf that runs alone starves. The wolf in a pack survives winter. Clayton walked to the wagon and unhitched his horse. Then he picked up a hammer from Henry's scattered tools. "If you won't take help," Clayton said, his voice rough, "you'll take company." Henry stopped. He turned. A slow, cracked smile crossed his weathered face. "Can you swing that hammer, Mr. Morse?" "I used to. Long time ago." "Well then," Henry gestured to the pile of timber. "Let's see if you remember how." Clayton rolled up his sleeves, and he got to work. Henry didn't trust charity, but he trusted work. And Clayton Morse was working. The sun broke through the clouds mid-morning, turning the frost to mud, and the mud to steam. Clayton had shed his coat within an hour. His fine shirt was soaked with sweat as he hauled timber from the pile to the work site. He was clumsy at first. His hands were too soft, his movements too careful. But he listened. He listened when Henry showed him how to notch the logs, how to read the grain in the wood, how to let the timber settle before you drove the nail. "Timber remembers how it grew," Henry said, running his hand along a plank. "Work with it, not against it." Clayton nodded, studying the grain lines like they were words in a book he'd forgotten how to read. "I forgot," Clayton said, his voice low. "Forgot what it feels like, to build something with my hands." "Most rich men do," Henry said. There was no judgment in his voice, just observation. Clayton didn't argue. It was true. They worked in a rhythm, Henry measuring, Clayton cutting, Martha securing the joints with rope until they could be properly nailed. The frame began to rise, slow, stubborn. Each piece fit into the next like a promise kept. Around noon, 3 riders passed on the road, town men judging by their clean hats and polished boots. They slowed when they saw him, saw Clayton Morse on his knees in the mud, hammer in hand. One of them called out, "That you, Morse, playing carpenter now?" Clayton didn't look up. He just drove another nail home. The riders laughed and moved on, but their voices carried on the wind. "Rich man playing poor. Probably won't last the day. Morse has lost his damn mind." Martha glanced at Clayton, waiting to see if he'd respond. He just reached for another nail, his face unreadable. "Don't listen to fools," Henry said quietly. "They got nothing better to do than tear down what others build." "I'm not listening." And he wasn't. For the first time in 2 years, Clayton's mind was quiet. No grief, no guilt, just the weight of the hammer, the bite of the saw, the satisfaction of seeing something rise where there had been nothing but wreckage before. By sunset, the first wall stood complete. They sat together in the dirt, passing a canteen of water, too tired to speak. Clayton's hands were raw and blistered. His back ached in ways he'd forgotten were possible. But when he looked at that wall, solid, square, true, something in his chest loosened. He hadn't thought about Sarah's death all day. For the first time since she passed, he'd gone hours without that crushing weight in his lungs. The grief was still there. It would always be there. But for one afternoon it had stepped aside and let him breathe. "You did good work today," Henry said. "So did you." Martha smiled. "Sweat's the only currency that never loses value." They sat until the stars came out, and Clayton realized he didn't want to go home. He didn't want to trade this tired, aching peace for the crushing silence of his empty house. But eventually, he stood. "I'll be back tomorrow." "We'll be here," Henry said. "Timber don't raise itself." Clayton rode home in the dark, his body exhausted, but his mind clearer than it had been in years. When he reached the big house, he didn't go inside right away. He just stood in the yard, looking up at all those empty, dark windows. Then he turned and looked back toward the valley, where a single, brand-new wall stood against the stars. Martha smelled it before she saw it. That sharp, electric bite in the air, the kind that meant another storm was coming, and this one felt meaner than the first. 3 days had passed since Clayton started working with them. 3 days of steady, back-breaking progress. 2 walls were up. The third was half-finished. The foundation was reinforced. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm. The 3 of them moving around each other like dancers who'd practiced the steps 100 times before. But now the sky was turning ugly. "Storm coming," Martha said, looking west. The clouds were massing low and black, moving fast across the valley, like wolves on a scent. Henry looked up from his measuring. "How long?" "Hour. Maybe less." Clayton wiped sweat from his forehead. "We should secure what we can, tie down the walls, cover the tools." They worked fast, driving stakes, wrapping rope around the standing walls to anchor them against the wind. But the storm came faster. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 10 minutes, and the wind hit like a physical fist. Clayton's horse screamed, snapped its tether, and bolted, disappearing into the gathering dark. "Damn," Clayton muttered, watching it go. "You're staying with us, then," Henry said. It wasn't a question. They huddled in the only protected corner where 2 new walls met and formed a crude shelter. Martha had grabbed blankets from the wagon. They wrapped them tight, pressing close for warmth. The wind howled through the open frame. Sleet hammered against the very walls they had just built. It was going to be a long night. "Reminds me of '83, Henry said after a while. His voice was steady, almost conversational, like they were sitting by a fire instead of huddling against a blizzard. "That winter the snow came in October and didn't stop till March." "We were younger then," Martha said. "Not by much," Henry chuckled. Clayton listened to them talk. Their voices were low and familiar, the way people sound when they've shared an entire lifetime. He thought about Sarah, about the conversations they'd had in the dark when she was sick, when words were all they had left. "Why do you stay?" Clayton asked suddenly. The words were out before he could stop them. "Why rebuild here? You could move to town, a smaller place. Easier." Henry was quiet for a long moment. The wind howled. "We lost our boy in the war," Henry said finally, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Daniel. He was 23. Clayton hadn't known. I'm sorry. This is the last place he knew as home," Martha said softly, her voice thick. "He's buried. On the hill, behind the cabin." Her voice broke. "We can't leave him." The wind screamed, and something in the new frame creaked. A loud, ominous groan. Clayton shifted, trying to see in the darkness. "That beam. It's giving way." "Let it go," Henry said, his voice tight. "We'll fix it tomorrow." But Clayton was already moving. He pushed through the blankets and out into the wind, stumbling to where the main support beam was bowing under the pressure. If it snapped, the whole structure would collapse, everything they'd built. He braced himself under it, taking the weight on his shoulders. "Morse!" Henry shouted. "Get back here! It's not worth it!" "Not yet!" Clayton gritted his teeth. His boots slid in the mud as the beam groaned above him. Every gust of wind tried to tear it from his grip, but he held on. He held the structure together with nothing but stubborn will and burning muscles. Then Henry was beside him, adding his own frail weight. And then Martha, small but strong, wedging a spare timber under the beam to give it support. Together the three of them held. They held through the worst of the storm. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time lost all meaning in the howling dark, but eventually, the wind eased, the sleet turned to snow. Then it stopped. The sky began to lighten in the east. They'd made it. Clayton slid down to sit in the mud, his entire body shaking with exhaustion and cold. "I thought money could buy me peace," he said, the words just falling out of him. All it bought was silence. Martha sat beside him, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "Silence ain't peace, child," she said, her voice worn thin. "Peace is earned by facing what broke you." Henry stood over them, surveying the damage. The beam had held. The walls were intact. They had survived. Clayton looked at his raw, bleeding hands. He looked at the two old, exhausted people beside him. A storm shows you who you really are. What you do after, that shows who you'll become. And for the first time since Sarah died, Clayton knew exactly what he needed to do next. By noon, the whole town knew. Clayton Morse, the richest man in the valley, had spent the night at the Doyle place. Tongues wagged like prairie grass in a high wind. Clayton rode into town for more supplies. His clothes were still caked in mud from the storm. Exhaustion was carved into every line of his face. He tied his horse outside the general store and walked inside. He felt the weight of their stares like hands on his back. The conversation died the second he entered. Mrs. Patterson stood at the counter, her face pinched with curiosity and judgment. Old Mr. Chen was by the seed barrels, pretending not to listen. And near the window, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, was Warren Kent, the banker. Kent had a smile that never, ever reached his eyes. "Morning, Morse," Kent said, his voice smooth as snake oil. "Heard you had quite the adventure last night." Clayton ignored him. He walked to the counter. "Need 50 pounds of nails and 2 more coils of rope." The store owner, Davies, nodded and moved to fill the order. But Kent wasn't finished. "Playing saint won't bring her back, you know." Clayton's hand tightened on the counter. "I'm not playing anything. Could have fooled me." Kent pushed off the wall and sauntered closer. The great Clayton Morse crawling in the mud with a couple of has-beens. Kent's voice dripped with false concern. "What's next? Going to give away your whole fortune? Build cabins for every sad story in the valley?" "Warren," Davies said quietly from behind the counter, "leave it alone." "I'm just curious." Kent smiled his oily smile. "Man loses his wife, and suddenly he's out there trying to save the world. It's almost tragic." Clayton turned, slowly. His fists were clenched at his sides, and for one dangerous moment he wanted to drive his knuckles into Kent's smug face. He wanted to wipe that smile away with blood and violence. But then he thought of Henry and Martha, working in silence while the town gossiped. He thought of their dignity, a dignity earned through decades of refusing to bend. Let dogs bark. The caravan moves on. "You done?" Clayton asked, his voice flat. Kent blinked, surprised by the lack of a fiery reaction. "What? You done running your mouth? Because I've got work to do, and you're wasting my time." Clayton paid for his supplies. He loaded them onto his horse, and he walked out without another word. Behind him, he heard Kent's voice rising in frustration, but the words didn't matter anymore. He drove back to the Doyle place, his jaw tight, but his conscience clear. When he arrived, Henry and Martha were already working. They'd cleared the debris from the storm and were measuring for the roof frame. Neither of them asked where he'd been or why his knuckles were white on the reins. They just handed him a hammer and went back to work. That night, they ate stew by firelight. Clayton's hands were blistered and screaming. His shoulders felt like they were on fire. But when Henry passed him the water canteen and said, "You're getting the hang of it," Clayton felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he belonged. 1 week later, Clayton stood in the doorway. They had just hung the threshold, the dividing line between the outside cold and the inside warmth. And in that moment, he finally understood what he'd been building. The cabin was nearly complete. Walls solid, roof frame assembled, windows set in their frames. All that remained was the final section of roof and the interior finishing work. The afternoon sun slanted through the doorway, throwing long shadows across the new floorboards. It smelled like fresh-cut pine. And possibility. Henry and Martha had invited him inside to celebrate, such as it was. Martha's stew bubbled on the newly installed stove. The three of them sat on makeshift benches, eating and resting in the space they had built together. "It's a good house," Clayton said. "It'll last another 50 years, Henry agreed. He paused. "If the storms don't take it first." There was something in his tone, a resignation, a deep, cold darkness that didn't match the strength of the walls around them. Clayton set down his bowl. "What is it, Henry?" Henry and Martha exchanged a look that passed a lifetime of shared secrets between them. Then Henry reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded paper, worn at the creases, like it had been opened and read 100 times. "Bank sent this," Henry said, his voice flat. He handed it over. "Before the first storm. We got 30 days. Then the land goes to auction." Clayton unfolded the notice. "Foreclosure, due to unpaid debts, accumulated over 3 failed harvest years. And medical expenses. The amount owed was substantial, more than most families saw in a lifetime. But to Clayton, it was nothing. He kept that much in accounts he forgot he had. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because we weren't looking for a rescue," Martha said gently, but her eyes were firm. "We knew what we were doing, Clayton. We're building this cabin for whoever comes next." "The work," Henry added, his voice hollow. "The work's its own reward." Clayton stared at the paper. His mind raced. He could pay the debt in an afternoon, buy the land outright, ensure they never worried about money again. But he knew how that would land. He knew it would feel like charity, like pity, like everything they'd refused from the very beginning. "Who holds the note?" Clayton asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Warren Kent." Of course it was. Clayton's blood ran cold. Kent. The man had been buying up distressed properties all over the valley, turning desperate situations into personal profit. He probably had a dozen foreclosures lined up, just waiting to sweep through like a second, man-made storm. This wasn't just bad luck. This was an execution. Clayton folded the paper carefully and handed it back. "We're finishing this cabin," he said. Henry looked up. "Clayton, you heard us. We are finishing all of it," Clayton insisted. "The roof, the floor, everything." He stood up, pacing the small room they had built. "And when it's done—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "When it's done, I'll handle Kent." "We don't want—" Martha started. "I know what you don't want," Clayton interrupted, but his voice was gentle. "You don't want charity. You don't want a rescue." He looked at Henry. "But Henry, you once told me that some things you pay forward." "This is me," Clayton said, a new hardness in his voice. "Paying it forward, not just for you, for everyone Kent is trying to bury." Henry studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. Slow and deliberate. That night, after the Doyles had gone to sleep in the wagon, Clayton sat by the dying fire. He wrote a letter to his lawyer in town. The instructions were simple. Purchase the Doyle property from Kent at whatever price he names. Then transfer the deed to Henry and Martha, anonymously, through a trust. Some gifts had to be given in silence. Some battles had to be fought where no one could see. The best thing you can build for someone, Clayton thought, is a reason to keep building. He sealed the letter and tucked it into his coat. Tomorrow he'd ride to town and set everything in motion. Tonight he'd sleep in the new barn, under a roof he'd helped raise with his own hands. For the first time in 2 long, empty years, Clayton Morse felt like he was building towards something, instead of just hiding from everything. Warren Kent stood on the bank steps like a king on a shoddy throne. He held the foreclosure papers in his hand, and he was smiling. It was high noon. Half the town had gathered in the square. Word had spread that Kent was making an announcement. Something about expanding his holdings, about progress and opportunity. But everyone knew what it really meant. More families losing their land, more history erased for profit. Clayton arrived on horseback, riding slow through the crowd. People stepped aside, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. He'd become the town's favorite piece of gossip, the rich man who'd lost his mind, the one who spent his days hammering nails with a couple of old-timers instead of running his empire. Let them talk. He dismounted and walked toward the bank steps, his boots echoing on the wooden planks. Kent saw him coming. His smile widened. "Morse, come to witness progress?" Clayton stopped at the base of the steps. "I've come to make you an offer." Kent laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I'm not selling anything, Morse. I'm buying." He held up the foreclosure papers for the crowd to see. "In fact, I'm pleased to announce the acquisition of the Doyle property. Prime land, excellent location. Once we clear the old structures, it'll be perfect for—" "I'll buy it from you." The crowd went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Kent's smile faltered. "What?" "The Doyle property." Clayton's voice was clear and carried across the square. "Name your price. I'll buy it. Right now." Kent descended the steps slowly, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." "Why?" Kent sneered. "They're just a couple of old folks, holding on to dirt that's not worth the effort to plow." "Why do you care?" Clayton met his gaze, steadily. "Because they built that cabin with their hands, because their son is buried on that hill." He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Kent could hear. "Because you can foreclose on land, Kent, but you can't foreclose on dignity." Kent's face darkened. "You can't save everyone, Morse. This is just business." "No," Clayton said, his voice quiet but intense. "This is what matters." And I finally remembered the difference. He reached into his coat. He didn't pull out the bank draft his lawyer had prepared. He pulled out a different document, a folded, yellowed piece of paper. "My lawyer was busy last night," Clayton said. "He found this. It's the original survey map for this valley, from 30 years ago." Kent's face went white, utterly, deathly white. "You'll notice," Clayton continued, his voice rising again for the crowd, "that the Doyle property line looks different." "That's a fake," Kent hissed. "Is it? Because it's signed by the county surveyor, and it shows that the spring Kent's new properties rely on actually originates on Doyle land." A murmur went through the crowd. "You've been strangling them," Clayton said, the pieces fitting together with sickening clarity. "You've been diverting their water. That's why their harvests failed." "That's a lie," Kent shouted. "Is it? Or is this the lie?" Clayton pulled out a second document, the bank draft. "Here's my offer, Kent. You sign over the Doyle property, free and clear, right now." "Or what?" Kent spat. "Or I don't buy it." Clayton paused. Instead, I'm going to fund a lawsuit for the Doyles, for land theft, water theft, and predatory lending. And I'm going to have my lawyers look into every single acquisition you've made in the last 10 years. He looked around at the crowd, at the faces of other families Kent had acquired. "I've got the time," Clayton said, his voice dropping to ice. "And I've got the money. But the real question is, Kent, do you?" The crowd pressed closer, sensing blood in the water. Kent looked around. He saw his reputation, his power, his entire house of cards crumbling in real time. He was a powerful man, but Clayton Morse was wealthier, more connected, and most importantly, he was angry in a way that made him dangerous. Kent snatched the transfer papers from his clerk. His hand was shaking. "Fine," he hissed. "You want to waste your money on sentiment? Be my guest." He signed the transfer with violent, angry strokes. Then he shoved the deed at Clayton. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just another rich fool, playing games with people's lives." Clayton took the deed. He tucked it carefully into his coat. "Maybe," he said, "but at least I'm playing on the right side." Kent stormed back into the bank, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. The crowd erupted. Murmurs, shouts, some approving, some disapproving, all fascinated. Clayton didn't wait for their verdict. He mounted his horse, and he rode out of town, heading back to the valley, back to where two old people were probably still working, unaware that their home had just been saved. When he arrived, Henry and Martha were on the roof, laying the final shingles. They looked up when they heard the horse, squinting into the afternoon sun. Clayton dismounted. He pulled the deed from his coat. He walked to the base of the cabin and held it up so Henry could see. "It's yours," Clayton called up. "Always was. I just made it legal." Henry's hammer stopped, mid-swing. He stared down at Clayton, then at the paper in his hand. Slowly, he climbed down the ladder, Martha following right behind him. Henry's hand shook as he took the deed. He unfolded it, read it twice. Then he looked up at Clayton, his old eyes suddenly wet. "Why?" he whispered. "Because some things," Clayton said, his voice rough, "you pay forward. You taught me that." Martha pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Henry folded the deed carefully. He held it against his chest like it was a prayer. We don't have words for this, son," Henry said. "Don't need words," Clayton replied. He clapped Henry on the shoulder. "We just need to finish that roof before the next storm hits." Henry laughed, a sound like breaking ice, painful and relieved all at once. Then he gripped Clayton's shoulder, squeezed once, and climbed back up the ladder. They worked until sunset, the three of them, laying the final shingles that would keep the cabin whole through whatever came next. A deed is just paper. The land belongs to those who love it. Clayton helped Martha plant the last flower, a purple aster, beside the new doorstep. The cabin stood whole, weathered already by one hard winter, but ready for 50 more. Spring had come to the valley. The snow had melted, revealing green grass and wildflowers that turned the hillsides into a painting. 3 months had passed. 3 months since that day in town. 3 months since Clayton had handed over the deed. And everything had changed. The cabin was complete, roof solid, walls chinked and sealed, windows fitted with real glass. Inside there was a stove, a table, and chairs that Henry had carved during the long winter evenings. The floor was swept clean, and curtains hung in the windows. White lace, Martha said, that she'd saved for 40 years, waiting for the right home. Today was the blessing. The whole valley had come, not just to see the cabin, but to witness what it represented. Neighbors who had gossiped now brought food and tools and quiet apologies. Even some of the town folks had made the trip, though they stood awkwardly at the edges, uncertain of their welcome. Clayton stood near the porch, watching it all unfold. He'd brought a photograph with him. Sarah, in her wedding dress, smiling that smile that had once been his whole world. He'd carried it, folded in his pocket, for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Martha saw him holding it. That her? Yeah, she was beautiful. She was everything, Clayton said. He looked at the cabin, at the people gathered around it, at the life that had bloomed from broken timber and shared labor. She would have loved what we built here. You built more than a cabin, Clayton, Martha said, her hand on his arm. So did you. Henry approached, carrying 2 tin cups of cider. He handed one to Clayton. Got something to say to the crowd, Henry said. Thought you should hear it first. What's that? That this cabin's got a name now. Henry gestured to the hillside behind them, where their son's grave stood, marked with a simple stone. We're calling it Daniel's Promise. Because, Henry said, his voice thick, every home worth building is a promise kept to someone we loved. Clayton's throat tightened. He raised his cup. To Daniel, and to promises. They drank together, then walked toward the gathering. Henry climbed onto the new porch and raised his voice. Folks, thank you for coming. This cabin, Daniel's Promise, it's more than just walls and a roof. It's what happens when people remember. Remember that we're all just trying to survive the storms, together. The crowd murmured in agreement. And I want to thank Clayton Morse, Henry continued, not for his money, not for his land. He looked right at Clayton, but for remembering that the best thing a man can build is friendship. The rest is just timber. Applause rippled through the gathering. Clayton felt dozens of eyes on him, some warm, some still skeptical. But it didn't matter anymore. He wasn't building for their approval. He was building because it was the only thing that made sense. After the speeches, after the food, after most of the crowd had drifted away, Clayton prepared to leave. Henry and Martha walked him to his horse. Doors always open, Henry said. Your family now. I'll remember that. Martha hugged him, a quick, fierce embrace that smelled like lavender and wood smoke. You gave us more than land, Clayton, she whispered. You gave us witness. That's rarer than gold. You gave me a reason to stop hiding, Clayton replied. That's everything. He mounted his horse and rode toward the ridge, the same path he'd taken that first morning, the morning he'd seen 2 bent figures struggling against the storm. At the top, he turned back. Henry and Martha stood on their new porch, waving. Behind them, the cabin rose, solid and true, against the spring sky. A testament to what people can build when they stop running from pain and start building toward hope. Clayton waved back. Then he urged his horse toward home. But this time, home didn't feel empty. This time, he knew that whenever the silence got too heavy, he could ride down to the valley. He could sit at a table where 3 chairs waited, where the door was always open, where family meant the people you built something with, not just the ones you were born to. Some men build empires, some men build bridges. Clayton Morse had learned the only thing worth building was what you could leave behind in better shape than you found it. Land, love, and the people you were blessed enough to walk beside. He rode into the sunset, tired and whole, ready for whatever storm came next. The measure of a man ain't what he owns, it's what he'd give away, and still stand tall. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe.